Australia's gone through a quite remarkable decade in climate policy. I've been covering it since about 2008, and in that time there has been, well, 5 Prime Ministers, all of whom have risen and fallen to some degree on climate policy. At the same time, we've made commitments to the global community about our emissions and how much we will reduce them. We've initially pledged to reduce our emissions by 5% on 2000 levels by the end of this decade, and depending who you listen to, we're either on track or not on track to meet that target. Just recently, we also committed to reducing our emissions by 26 to 28% from 2005 levels. Note the difference in the baseline. That sounds very familiar to the US target, but the US are committing to do that by 2025, and we're committing to do that by 2030. The question is going to be twofold. First, how will we achieve that target? Climate Action Tracker recently, it's a group of 4 sort of very independent and very well credentialed consultants and think tanks who have been doing assessments of major countries' commitments, recently said Australia was the furthest behind of all the developed countries to have policies in place to meet their 2030 goal. The gap between what we've currently got legislated and what they think it can achieve and what we need to achieve in terms of total emissions cuts by 2030 is greater than the US, Canada, New Zealand, and a range of other like-minded and like countries. In about 7 weeks, the world's countries will meet in Paris, and we expect, or there's a strong chance, some agreement will be signed, some kind of lasting agreement will be signed on climate change. Thinking back to Copenhagen, this seems like a small miracle. A lot of people, I personally wasn't there, but I was reporting on the issues, but a lot of people who were there all have a war story. They've all got a bit of trauma about it. I don't think the poor city of Copenhagen has ever recovered. Paris will likely deliver an agreement that will be built on over many decades. Its ultimate aim is to restrain global warming to less than 2 degrees from pre-industrial levels. Unfortunately, there's 149 pledges now under that process from countries to reduce their emissions out to 2030. A number of people have done assessments of that, and those assessments suggest that we're still wide of that 2-degree mark. Overnight, the European Commission put out its assessment and said if the targets were committed to, it would take us on a pathway to 3 degrees. What does that mean? Well, it likely means we'll have to revise our targets, all the world will have to revise its targets in the coming years, and that's where Australia and the policy puzzle comes in. Because not only do we seemingly have a gap between the target we've pledged, we've also potentially got a larger gap when we start thinking about the actual kinds of cuts we might need to make to meet the global commitment to restrain global warming to 2 degrees. So, what should we do? Well, we've got 3 experts on the stage, much smarter than me, been around much longer than me, who's going to talk you through some of the options. First up will be Professor David Karoly. He's a climate scientist at Melbourne University. He's been involved to differing degrees on the last 2 IPCC assessments of climate science, and he is also a board member of the Climate Change Authority, one of the original board members, and continues to serve. Anthea Harris will be next. Now, I had to write down the name of the department, Anthea, because all Victorian departments have very, very long names. You're the lead Deputy Secretary for Department of Economic Development, Jobs, Transport and Resources, but don't let that title fool you. Anthea has been involved in climate policy for well over a decade. She was involved in the development of the G-Gas scheme in New South Wales, Australia's first mandatory carbon trading scheme, and she's been involved at both the state and the national level in the development of other carbon pricing schemes, and most recently was the Chief Executive of the Climate Change Authority until she moved back to the Victorian Department. And last but not least is Tony Wood. He's the Energy Policy Director of the Grattan Institute. He's got a long history in energy policy, working for Origin for many years before that, and he's also worked for the Clinton Foundation on a range of low carbon technologies for a number of years. So I'd like to welcome first up David Karoly, who will have a short slide presentation too.
Thanks, Tom, and it's a pleasure to be here. I've been asked to give, if you like, a sort of global perspective from the climate as well as the greenhouse gas emissions on what's coming up to the Paris conference. I'm not going to really speak about the solutions and what's going to happen beyond Paris very much, but really what the challenge is in terms of meeting this global commitment of limiting greenhouse gas emissions so that global temperature rise is less than 2 degrees. But to set that in context, we should look first at what's happening to temperatures. Depending upon which newspaper you read or which blog site you look at, global warming stopped in 1998 and there's been no warming since then, or either it's been cooling. But if you actually look at the global temperatures, this is a record from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States, and it shows the average temperatures each year from 1990 right up until the first 8 months of this year for January to August. And you can actually see that if you could get a bet on, no bookmaker's actually taking this bet anymore, that 2015 will be the hottest year on record in the instrumental data. It already is by a significant margin, and that doesn't include September. We already know that's hot, and it's going to get hotter because we're also in an El Niño event. So yes, global warming has continued. There is a lot of natural variability, but the rate of warming has been substantial, of the order of 0.8 of a degree Celsius or a little bit more over the last 100 years. But what we can expect in the future depends on what happens in terms of greenhouse gas concentrations. It also depends on a lot of natural variability and uncertainties in the climate system. But when we look at this graph, which comes from the most recent IPCC assessment, this left-hand part shows the observed temperature variations over the 50 years from 1950 up till the year 2000. And then we look into the future, and there are two different scenarios. This upper one in red is the sort of business as usual emissions, what we would expect if we continue to burn fossil fuels and to grow emissions, as has happened over the last 50 and 100 years. And what we see is that the best estimate is 4 degrees of temperature rise relative to present day, possibly as much as nearly 6 degrees relative to present day, added onto the 0.8 of a degree we've had already. The alternative is this scenario, rapid emission reductions, which stabilise temperatures at only about 1 degree above the year 2000 levels, about 1.5 to 2 degrees or so above pre-industrial. The really interesting point is what is shown here is the uncertainty range. There is a large uncertainty associated with the uncertainties in the processes in the climate system. We have to think about what risk we want to take in global temperatures staying below 2 degrees or what risk we want to take in warming above 2 degrees. That will be determined by what happens in terms of future emissions. So now let's look at the different emission scenarios associated with those different emissions and those different temperature ranges. And here we are with business as usual. Current emissions are around 45 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. In this case, we end up with warming in this baseline scenario and carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere much greater than 1,000 parts per million. We are already at 400 parts per million, and that's already 40% higher than we had in pre-industrial times. The alternative to achieve warming of less than 2 degrees is this scenario here. And notice that greenhouse gas emissions go to 0 before the end of this century. So what Paris is about is setting the trajectories for all countries to contribute in a fair and equitable way to meeting these global targets of reducing greenhouse gas emissions so that they essentially decarbonise the global economy this century. And in fact, if we look at what's happened here, and we're now at 2015, this graph actually starts in 2010, we actually have to be dropping emissions pretty well straight away. So then we can look at what each country has committed to. And I'm not going to look at all 140 countries that have made commitments in their indicative nationally determined contributions leading into the Paris Conference. I'm just going to look at a number, including Australia. This is in fact a comparison that was put out by the Climate Change Authority in their report when they had a recommendation to the government on what Australia's emission reductions should be. Each country leading into Paris has indicated in a bottom-up process what they want to do as their fair and equitable contribution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. These are called INDCs, or Intended Nationally Determined Contributions to Global Emission Reductions. The Climate Change Authority recommended that Australia's emission reductions should be 30% below 2000 levels by 2030 and 40 to 60% below 2000 levels by 2030. The Australian government listened to that advice, didn't take much account of it, and then agreed to, or has put into the Australian indicative nationally determined contributions, emission reductions of 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030. Tom's already mentioned that. The really important thing to understand is that Australian emissions grew by 5% from 2000 to 2005. So to put different countries' emission reduction targets, or even the Australian emission reduction targets, to a common baseline, the Australian government's target, 26 to 28% below 2005 levels, is only 20 to 22% below 2000 levels. So now we can do some comparison, and the comparisons between different countries' targets depend upon what metrics you use. So I'm going to look at a couple of different metrics, and the first one is just the absolute percentage reduction in emissions. And if we look at this, Australia sits in roughly the middle of the pack in terms of the Climate Change Authority's recommendation. This shows changes from 2005 baseline to I've got to look at this, I think it's to 2025. So relative to that period, the Climate Change Authority's recommendation is actually 36%. The Australian government's would be 26%, and that would sit back here, right in the middle of the pack, and that was why the Australian government said a 26 to 28% reduction was in the middle of the pack. What about if you use another metric, like per capita emissions? And this shows, in these bars, how Australia's per capita emissions of greenhouse gases. And if you were going to carve up pizza and distribute it to everyone in the room, or carve up chocolate cake and give it to everyone in the room, everyone would think that actually it's probably fair that everyone gets the same amount. But of course the alternative would be to say, well, actually the people in the front should have more because they're closer and they can eat it and get to it faster. Now, maybe Australia and the United States are like the people in the front row who could get to the greenhouse gas emissions through burning coal and oil and natural gas faster. And that's why their per capita emissions are higher than some of these other countries, because Australia hasn't reduced its emissions over the last 10 years. In fact, Australian emissions per person have reduced a small amount, but actually there's been very little reduction in emissions from burning oil or coal or natural gas. Australia has the highest per capita emissions, and also in this bottom panel has the highest emissions in terms of per unit GDP of any developed country in the world. So Australia's got such a high starting point that even with the Climate Change Authority's recommended reductions or with the government's recommended reductions, Australia is still the highest emitter per person of any developed country and the highest emitter per unit GDP. It's not clear that that is a fair amount because Australia wants a bigger share of the cake in terms of per capita greenhouse gas emissions. Well, let's look at whether these bottom-up, nationally determined INDCs, the nationally determined contributions, are enough to avoid 2 degrees of warming. Well, there's certainly a reduction in emissions. This is emissions globally. This is where we would be heading with no emission reductions. That's the reductions using existing targets and commitments to emission reductions prior to Paris. It's a very small reduction. There are very large reductions needed, and this is what is needed. This is the gap between the current commitments and what is needed to avoid 2 degrees, and this is what is needed to avoid 1.5 degrees. There are large gaps here between the current commitments for emission reductions and what is needed to avoid 2 degrees. That means that even if all countries meet their intended nationally determined contributions, their emission reductions, even more action will be needed. So the most important thing after Paris is, first of all, for all countries to honour their commitments to reduce emissions, and then to review and work even harder, because all countries have agreed to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees. If that is a real commitment, then all countries will need to enhance their reductions. Here is what the temperature range is for the current commitments. Its best estimate of 2.7 degrees. This is what it is for, this is with the INDCs, and this is what it is with current commitments. 3.6 degrees is the best estimate with existing commitments, 2.7 degrees of warming, but notice that's a mid-range. We don't know what risk that'll be. There's a 50% chance that that will be less and 50% chance that it'll be greater, and the actual greater warming estimates. Realistically, we have one planet. We're not, unless you're looking at either Interstellar or other science fiction movies, not going to have other planets to live on in the foreseeable future. If we want our planet to have a climate which is as close as possible to we've had for all of human civilization, we need to honour the commitments to limit warming to 2 degrees. These are not my conclusions. These are the conclusions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Yes, the human influence on the climate system is clear. The more we have greenhouse gas emissions, the more we disrupt our climate, and the more we risk severe, pervasive, and in some cases irreversible impacts. We have the means to limit global warming, and we're going to hear more about that from Tony a little bit later on, but we can also limit global warming and build a prosperous and sustainable future. And I'm not sure that anyone would object to a more prosperous and sustainable future. Thank you.
Now, I've been asked to talk a little bit about the kind of international perspective about Australia's commitments and really how that all fits together. So I thought it might be worth talking a little bit about what we expect the agreement to look like that might come out of Paris. It's worth remembering that it won't almost certainly look anything like the Kyoto Protocol. No one is expecting that the target, so these, and you can tell by the names of them, your intended nationally determined contributions will be binding. On the other hand, I don't think that's a bad thing, and it would be a bad thing if any countries were trying to sort of stick in the mud about that, and I don't think countries now are, because the important thing is that countries want to get on and do things, and if the notion of something being binding, even though nothing bad actually happens to you if you don't meet your commitment, if that was a sticking point, that would be a bad thing. It's also worth remembering that it's not the end of some kind of process once we sign up to an agreement in Paris. It's another step along the way. We don't go along to Paris, sign up some things, walk away, and we're done. It's another process that we keep coming back, and hopefully doing a few things that end up ratcheting up the degree of ambition in terms of what countries are actually doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A big thing that should come out of the agreement, while it'll be up to individual countries to pledge whatever their commitment will be, and we've already seen that very large numbers of pledges that are already coming forward about what countries intend to commit to, will be rules around transparency, so that we'll be able to see and track progress along the way. We'll be able to see what countries are committed, we'll be able to see how they're going towards those commitments, we'll be able to tell how countries are going. That creates opportunities for international discussions, pressure from NGOs, other countries being able to look at each other and have that kind of international peer group pressure, which hopefully will lead to better outcomes along the way. That's also related to something that we hope comes out of this agreement, that Paris and its subsequent opportunities to celebrate success and learn from the positive experiences of others. So too many of these conversations have always been framed around burden sharing and all of the, in a very negative light, around trying to get to the slices of pizza in the front row. And actually there are a huge number of co-benefits associated with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We've had lots of successes. The general experience tends to have been when people have tried to do things, they've well, certainly for Australia, we've done a whole lot of modelling that says it'll be okay, when actually we've tried to do them in practice, they've inevitably turned out cheaper than what we ever thought they were going to be when we first modelled them. So providing opportunities to learn from others, celebrate success and give others confidence to keep going, we hope will be part of this new agreement too. So for Australia walking into these negotiations, what do other countries think when Australia comes along? Well, we're a very wealthy country, so compare with just about every other country turning up to those negotiations, we are much wealthier than them. We also have extremely high emissions per capita, as David referred to earlier. So we really are one of the people who've been getting to the pizza a lot earlier than others. Australia has also played traditionally a quite constructive role in negotiations about trying to bring people together, to try and come up with good ideas. It has really played a constructive role. That's despite having some on-again, off-again performances on the international regime, not ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, then ratifying. So I think there's some degree of confusion around Australia's long-term position on some of these issues. But that said, our negotiators and the teams that we've sent along do have a good reputation in the international arena. In terms of our own target, so David has already talked about the fact that others have commented on what might be perceived as the inadequacies of the target that the Australian government has committed to date. So it's not regarded by many as being a very strong target. In fact, there's been lots of commentary by a number of groups that this is a target that's not at the stringent end. In fact, it's quite at the reasonably loose end, which then runs into the question for Australia and for other countries as well. Will we see this ratcheting up of targets? Either in Paris, will other countries actually, when they get there, put stronger targets on the table than they had spoken about to date? Or will, in reasonably short periods of time, actually increase the levels of ambition that they had actually committed to in Paris? We would hope, given the fact that when you add up all of these targets, they're so far away from the international goal of trying to limit warming to less than 2 degrees. This ratcheting up of targets and ambition over time is actually important. If we look back, we don't have much history in this sphere, of course, but if we look back at the history that we have, it doesn't lead you to a huge amount of optimism on that score. And so countries like Australia that have put down reasonably long-term targets all the way out to 2030, well, there's question marks, certainly in my mind, about whether we actually will change those targets over time. The reason I say that is we look back to the targets that countries put down for 2020. Australia was one of several countries that put down not just a single point target, but a target range. So we did, the European Union did, Norway did, a few others did. No one increased their targets from their minimum point that they put down in the first place. So Australia's actual commitment still is that it would do a minimum of 5% reduction compared with 2000 levels by 2020, but that it would do more under certain circumstances. The Climate Change Authority has done a report. It went through methodically, looking through the different things that are in our international commitment. As Australia said, we would do more if certain things happened. Those things happened, but Australia has not increased its commitment for 2020, and it appears very unlikely to do so at this point. So given that's been the international experience to date, it will be important to see how the framework ends up to allow for and encourage revisions upwards of targets over time. Now that brings us to the issue of policies and how Australia might be perceived in terms of the policies required to meet its target. As David mentioned before, Carbon Tracker said that Australia was the most far away in terms of having the policies in place to be able to meet the target that it's put down. It's worth reflecting on the fact that it's not just Carbon Tracker, everybody is watching everybody else. So if you ask people in Australia, you know, what should Australia's target be? The first question is usually, well, tell me about other countries' targets, and surely shouldn't we do something comparable to that? And then once people hear what all the different countries' targets are, the next question is almost always, well, yeah, but are we sure they're going to get there? What policies have they got in place? I don't want to hear about announcements or plans. I want to know, have they got the legislation there now? Are they really going to do it? All of those sorts of things. Now, there's a bit of glass houses around that, of course, so we too, if we're going to expect that of others, need to be in a position to be able to demonstrate how we're going to meet our own targets. Now, Tony's going to talk a bit more about this, but it's fair to say that the post-2020 landscape, it's not bare, but it's bearish. That there's a lot of room for some colouring in on that page, it's fair to say. So we do have the renewable energy target that's in place. We understand that we're getting more confidence that what the target that is there is settled. That said, for the rest of the energy sector, that's probably one of the blankest bits of the canvas. It's very unclear how the other large planks of our current national policies, so our direct action fund, the auction, and our safeguard mechanism, how they will constrain emissions in the energy sector, which is of course tremendously important if we're going to achieve the targets that Australia has put down. So that's a bit of a watch this space, and there's lots and lots of people, including the Grattan Institute, thinking about what kinds of policies should we put in place, particularly for the energy sector, because it's such a large proportion of our emissions. It's an area where we know that there are plenty of things that we can do, and so it's always a key focus of attention and activity. The government has also said that it's going to be developing an energy efficiency, energy productivity plan. again, we haven't got details of that. We're looking forward to seeing what the details of that might be. One thing that has been flagged in concept in a number of government publications has been the idea of vehicle emission standards. Now, this is something that most other countries in the world have in place. 70% of vehicles sold into the world are sold into markets that have mandatory standards for vehicles. Australia doesn't have them. Australia's vehicle fleet is really quite spectacularly emissions intensive compared with other countries. It's getting better. Everyone's getting better. Our line is kind of continuing on. The gap seems to be getting bigger. It does seem to be an area where there's some pretty obvious scope for some intervention to bring us a bit more in line with a number of other countries. And I think that's definitely in the watch this space territory as well. In terms of what we might do in some of the other sectors, so there's the energy efficiency space is of course very broad. Energy efficiency activities are encouraged under the direct action, the auctioning process. We'll see how much that picks up of itself, but we'll see if there are any other regulatory or other incentive arrangements to promote energy efficiency coming out of that productivity plan. When the government announced its targets, it also talked about some other areas that might lead to emissions reduction, so synthetic greenhouse gases. This is something, it's actually a small proportion of Australia's total emissions, but again, watch this space. We'll see whether any kind of regulatory intervention in particular might be actually picked up there. Another key thing about, not just for Australia, but all countries thinking about how they might actually meet their targets is the degree to which you say, look, we have to do all of this domestically, or the extent to which we say, look, we'll do what we can domestically, but we won't limit our ambitions by that. We're also prepared to buy a bit extra from other countries in terms of purchasing emissions credits or units in some kind of international carbon trading regime. Now, Australia has moved a bit on this. It seemed to be that we're in a position where the government was very clearly not wanting to purchase international units. That seems to have moved, and we're in a position where it's not ruled out. So that's always something as well that we can keep an eye on to see what the balance, intended balance might be between domestic action, things that have to happen here in Australia versus things that we might top up that for by buying international units overseas. It's interesting if you have a look at the commitments that other countries have made, what their views about international carbon markets are. Lots of the commitments, these INDCs that countries have put forward don't reference international carbon markets at all, but some say very specifically that they are hoping for, intending to use these international carbon markets. And another comforting part about that is how many of those commitments reference the fact that if they want to use international carbon markets, they say very explicitly they want them to make sure that they're credible. They want to make sure that they've got somewhere some kind of UN stamp of approval, so that there's some kind of governance around these things. It's not some sort of white shoe brigade selling dodgy credits and allowing people to count them all. Now, finally, now that I work for a state government again, the Victorian government, the Victorian government's thinking on a number of fronts about its own climate change policies. The Victorian government's it said that it wants to regain a leadership position in terms of climate change policies. There's a number of reviews currently underway of our Climate Change Act, the EPA. There's an EPA review underway. Part of its terms of reference are explicitly about whether or not the EPA should regulate greenhouse gases. There's a lot of work going on in renewable energy. There was a roadmap paper that was released recently that talked about having a target of at least 20% renewables by 2020, and considering that target and target for beyond for renewable energy. There's work going on in energy efficiency. The government has said that it will be extending the the Victorian Energy Efficiency Trading Scheme. So there's a lot going on there. I must say, from a state government perspective, naturally enough, you want to know what the federal landscape looks like so that you can sensibly craft, state interventions to sort of, make a sensible whole. At the moment, because there's so many things at the Commonwealth level we're not quite sure what they're going to look like for the post-2020 landscape. It does feel a little bit like trying to do a jigsaw when you've got all the pieces but you haven't got the picture on the box. So we're in that stage at the moment of trying to figure out what the state government policies should look like in kind of an unclear federal government landscape. And on that note, I will leave it there and hand over to Tony, who will talk to you much more about policy positions.
Sometimes when I've been asked to give a speech, like daughters' weddings or whatever it might be, you go looking for best dad's jokes or something like that. There's not a very big lexicon for climate change joke books. So if anyone can start to dig them up, I'd be really interested in a reference. I've got on my desk a very faded cartoon, and it doesn't show up very well on the screen, so maybe I need to get it redone, but there's basically it looks to be a middle-aged gentleman and his wife watching television, and the wife turns to the husband and says, well, the Australian economy is going really, very well, but the planet, unfortunately, is doomed. And the gentleman says, well, I'm glad in that case I live in Australia and not on the Earth. I want to bring this back a little bit, as people have already suggested, to the what we might do. And I'm not about this evening to recommend what Australia's specific policy should be, but the framework in which this policy is going to take place, because it will unfold over the next year or so, and I think quite significantly. And one of the reasons for that is I don't think you can underestimate the importance of the fact we now have a post-2020 target. We can debate, and you've heard comments about whether that target is adequate, whether it's fair, in terms of Australia's fair share. One thing you can be sure of, that a target set in 2015 for 2030 will change. How that will change, how quickly it will change, remains to be seen. But I think the very important fact is we have one, and then you can start in earnest to think about what will be the domestic policies that might get us there. Secondly, I think we're seeing increasing agreement on what has to be done. Now that is a little unusual, and I'll come back to that in halfway through this presentation, because we haven't had anything like agreement, either within the political sphere of Australia, nor in the extent to which a whole range of other stakeholders would agree on the nature of the task. I think, therefore, there is an unusual opportunity to do something positive the next little while. There was once what I described in an article, a golden hour of opportunity. It was actually a bit more than an hour, but it seemed to be like 2007, 8, 9, when we looked like we were going to have a federal government policy, and we didn't. And so maybe we are seeing that alignment again, and when policy and opportunity in politics starts to align, then there's a real opportunity to do something. It may not be very pretty, what emerges next, but if it works, then I think we should grab it with both hands. So in terms of agreement, this is just recapping a little bit of what you've already heard. There are many things countries have agreed on. They've agreed on this INDC issue, and I still can never remember what the words stand for, so I'm glad that both David and Anthea have explained what the acronym is. The important thing is that Australia's target had to be more than the pre-existing target, and everybody used the 5%. They sort of quietly forgot about the 15 to 25. Although you could argue that we've still done okay in terms of extending the target. What's really tricky is the next bit, in how people will compare these, because every country in the world will argue its national circumstances. And whether or not you are in the front seat or the back seat, people will argue why they should have an entitlement to a bigger piece of the cake. Interestingly, however, I think for the first time we're also seeing global businesses that historically would not have taken place or taken part in this debate entering the discussion. After the World Gas Conference in August in Paris, a number of global oil and gas companies came out very strongly saying the world needs to move on climate change and give us some clear policies to signal how we can invest. Some of those companies are Australian companies, and they came back here and said more or less the same thing. And only last Sunday, a number of the very largest electricity companies in the world have called on governments to deliver some consistent policy so that they can make the investments that are necessary to cause the transition that we need. This is, again, reiterating slightly, the first bit is basically what we have agreed on domestically. It is very important to notice that both the major parties of politics in this country agree on these things. Secondly, we do have major businesses, BHP Billiton, AGL and others have said publicly they support Australia doing what it needs to do to contribute to achieving the 2-degree goal. We have seen people like the Queensland Resources Council, who represent the large resource companies, saying there is no future for coal and gas unless we can develop carbon capture and storage technologies. The last bit is quite a challenge, but that's what they're now saying. They are recognising that there is a significant change in language from what they were using 10 years ago, and even 5 years ago. And finally, organisations like the Minerals Council, which has been behind some of the largest public debates and public pushbacks on climate change policy, are now saying very clearly that there is a problem. And I guess we all know the first thing you are taught as in school and so forth, when you're going to do something and have to solve a problem, the first thing is recognise you actually have one. Otherwise, it's unlikely you'll try and solve it. The Climate Roundtable, which was a grouping of organisations including the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Industry Group, the Aluminium Council, and WWF and a couple of other NGOs, have said a number of things of what our policy should look like. Now, to some extent, one could argue that looks like saying we're all in favour of motherhood, but the interesting thing is that those groups came together and they all agreed on the words. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be a policy yet, but we are heading in a direction, I think, which gives one some cause for optimism. So what direction are we heading? This is the Australian version of what you saw from David earlier. It also, I think, highlights very clearly why the Australian government's task force that developed the recommendation that Australia's target should be 26 to 28% below 2005 levels is what it is against 2005 levels is because 2005-6 was the peak of our emissions, and so if you want to make your number look good, you choose that peak number. I'm not suggesting that other countries don't do that, by the way. Everyone will make the numbers look as good as they possibly can, and it'll be up to people like us to try and bring those numbers back to something that's comparable, as you've already heard David do. I guess what's interesting is where the lines are supposed to be going for Australia. So if you look at this line here, basically you can see it's pretty much a straight line. If we achieve our 5% reduction by 2000 levels by 2020 and draw a straight line to 2030, you get 26 to 28% basically. Now that just means that people spend about 6 or 8 months of a lot of bureaucrats' time when they could have just got a ruler out, I guess. But this is the target we developed. This is the target recommended by the Climate Change Authority, one that they would argue is more consistent with Australia's fair share of the global target. Now, the thing about this is, to some extent, people will argue, is it fair? Well, they'll also argue, is it hard or is it easy? And depending on what you're trying to prove, you will use that sort of language. So when you look at this chart, which is another way of looking at some of those things that David put up, what you can see here is compared to some developed countries. I'm not comparing us with countries, some of the big, rapidly developing economies like China or India, who are just about off the chart in most of these numbers, and it's very important that they take action as well. But if you look at these numbers, these are the numbers in terms of percentage reductions, and you can see very clearly that Australia is doing nothing like as much in terms of our promises compared to US, Canada and the EU, and that's partly because, as David said, our target is framed in 2030 rather than 2025 terms. In terms of targeted reductions per year, it's not insignificant, maybe not as much as the US is proposing to achieve. That's if they can get all this through their various legislative challenges. But by comparison with these other countries, we're doing a fair bit. And one of the reasons is, of course, is because our per capita emissions start off pretty bloody high, and even by 2030, they're still relatively high, particularly if the world's arguing that everybody in the world by 2030, which is presumably going to be somewhere between 7 and 8 billion people, should have an equal piece of that pie. That's when it gets interesting, because no one actually says this, but often what the arguments they use is that some of us are entitled to more of the pie than others. One, for example, argument is that, well, we're doing more with the activities that we do in Australia that produce greenhouse gases. we are producing more economic wealth in our exports for other countries than other people are. Therefore, we're entitled to have more emissions in this country. Or alternatively, we're coming off such an incredible resource base. We have been a resource-based export economy. It's going to be hard for us to reduce our emissions. And therefore, we should be allowed a little bit more leeway than others for whom it's a lot easier. That's the sort of arguments you'll hear, particularly as we debate the sort of policies that are going to unfold over the next 12 months. There is, generally speaking, a preferred plan. The OECD said this is what countries should do. The trick is, nobody does it. As far as I know, there is no country in the world who has actually done this. That is, put a price on carbon to start with, and then don't fiddle around with it. Don't add a whole lot of other policies which are fundamentally unnecessary or distracting. Only add those policies that really do address the areas where your fundamental central carbon price doesn't work. Now, there's all sorts of reasons for this. One of the reasons is, I would suggest, people don't like having a very visible carbon price. What most of us would argue, wouldn't it be good to have a very simple number? That's the price that we need to pay to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The answer is, if you've got one policy that produces that price, it's very visible. If you have 10 policies that all do little things separately, it's much harder to find the price, and therefore politicians, generally speaking, I would suggest, actually prefer the latter rather than the former, even though they will often say the opposite. So, what we have is this mess. We have a situation where we are, I guess, arguably the only country that's actually repealed a major piece of climate change legislation. We have a renewable energy target which has been tossed backwards and forwards so many times it must get dizzy. At the moment, there is some optimism that it might actually be stable, but the debate now is, and you may have seen some of this in the media, of whether it can now be achieved because we stuffed around so long putting it in place and making it firm. And there is still some debate as to whether people will gain that system. We do have a situation where the current government, has a plan or a policy mix which will probably be consistent with getting us to 2020. I should point out, by the way, coming back to this chart here, that if we start here, which is where we were at the beginning of this year, and these are the projections published by the Department of the Environment, this is where they were suggesting the projections were going to be. If we look at this wedge between 2020 and 2030, that's about 2 billion tonnes we would have to get out of the atmosphere between 2020 and 2030. But if we do achieve our 2020 target, it's actually, and we still keep doing this, then that wedge we have to get out is about 1 billion tonnes, 900 million tonnes. So actually, achieving that 2020 target becomes quite important. So the challenge at the moment is, can we put in place some domestic policies that might actually get us there? I would suggest it's highly unlikely that we're going to see anyone anytime soon seriously argue for an economy-wide cap-and-trade emissions trading scheme, despite the fact that most, I would suggest, advisors to governments would say that's the best way to go. That's not what we're likely to see. You've already heard, I'm sure, the ALP basically jumping around, trying to work out what they're going to say next. I've got no idea what they're going to say next, but they haven't quite worked out what it will be. The current government has got a series of policies that may very well be able to be re-engineered to become something of substance post-2020. But they've kicked most of the key hard decisions down the road. As Anthea said, they really haven't bitten on the bullet of what they need to do with electricity systems, and they haven't bitten on the bullet of what they do need to do with the concept of a safeguard mechanism, which is supposed to safeguard us against breakouts and emissions, but basically isn't designed to do that, and quite deliberately so for a while yet. So there are some things that could be done, but they've got some ways to go. So I would suggest, in summary, the way we are now in 2015, towards the end of 2015 as we head into this Paris conference, is we do have, good news, we do have a post-2020 target. The target is less than it should be. There's probably more than it could have been. I think many people were a little surprised that the government didn't come up with a much lower target. In our view, and I think many people's view, an explicit carbon price is by far the best way to go, but that is hard to do because of the messiness we've had politically over the last 4 or 5 years. Therefore, we need to think about something which might be a messier outcome but could still deliver something. We have to start from where we are. I don't think it makes any sense at all for the Labor Party to basically say, we're going to chuck it all out and start again, which is more or less what the current Liberal coalition government did. That would be, I think, an ugly place to be. Industry is looking for far more credibility than that in terms of how we move forward. I think it's critical that we achieve some degree of bipartisan support, because without that, you're not going to get the changes necessary in terms of long-term investment. So to some extent, and you always make these sort of statements with a little tinge of regret, I think that second best policy that actually gets implemented, as it always is, might actually be better than first best policy that never does. Thank you.
So, as is customary at these events, there'll be time for questions from the audience, and we should probably have about 25 minutes to do that. Just as a starting point, I won't ask too many questions. I get to ask questions of these people all the time. I might start with David, actually. If we go back to your graph about global emissions and how global emissions have to track towards 2 degrees, of course, the squiggle gets right to the bottom. In fact, it hits 0. And that's not something people talk about a lot in the national debate. We're having a conversation about 2030 and where we have to get to there, but of course 2030 is not the end goal. Here we have what's called decarbonisation, and it's a word that's increasingly cropping up in a number of the discussions. Quite notably, the G7 put out a statement during the year saying that that would be the ultimate goal. Could you, the IPCC in the 5th assessment painted a little bit of a picture of what that might actually look like. Could you maybe tell us what decarbonisation actually means and how that might be achieved, given that there are emissions that we probably can't get rid of or we can't control?
So I will try to paint a picture. It's a world, a decarbonised world has been described, and there are a number of different ways that that can be achieved depending on choices that different countries make. Decarbonisation of the electricity sector means a combination of a range of zero carbon energy sources. So that can be primarily renewable energy, or it can be energy produced from burning fossil fuels, as long as 100% of the carbon dioxide emissions from those fossil fuels is captured and buried. And that technology of 100% carbon capture and storage from burning fossil fuels does not exist yet. And most estimates indicate it's expensive. Another possible source is nuclear power, which is currently used in a number of different countries, as well as being phased out in some countries because of the risks of the leakage of radioactive waste. So those energy sources. But there are, in fact, many, many other sources of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere in addition to direct electricity production. Most of us will still want to eat food to stay alive, and that leads to greenhouse gas emissions. And there are no known sources of producing zero emissions directly from agricultural production, because fertilisers, growing crops, animal agriculture all produce emissions. There are some possible solutions, which means planting more trees, changing agricultural production, capturing the some waste material and using that to produce energy, as well as growing more trees or producing biofuels and then capturing the carbon dioxide. So essentially what's called bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. It's not take a BECCS and lie down, which your parents or grandparents might have done. This is use BECCS and lie down and save the carbon dioxide. There are also, and it's critically important, ways that we have to change our transport systems so that they're not using fossil fuels. And that means electrification of all forms of transport, not using cars that are fueled by petrol or diesel. All of this is possible, but it doesn't appear to be a large part of either Australia's national policies or many policies around the world. The date, the timescale that we're talking about decarbonisation of the energy systems and the transport systems and going to negative greenhouse gas emissions in some ways is within many of our lifetimes. It's 2050 or earlier for developed countries. That's not very far away. That's 35 years. The infrastructure to have that available needs to be being built now, not planned in the future.
Thank you, David. So, given that's the long-term challenge, and we have at least one intermediate step put down by the government towards that, the Environment Minister has said on a number of times the direct action scheme is here for decades. He said that, in particular, if you don't know how the direct action scheme, I assume most people do know, there's two essential parts. There's what's called there's an emissions reduction fund where emitters paid or can bid in through an auction system to get paid to reduce their emissions through a range of projects. But then there's a second measure called the safeguard mechanism. And nominally this is supposed to start putting some caps on effectively the largest emitters in the country, industrial emitters. There's been some talk, the Environment Minister says those caps or those safeguards are here for decades and they will be the basis of our long-term transition towards this end goal. Do you guys believe that's the case? Do you believe that that's possible? Do you believe that's the right mechanism? And if not, as Tony, you alluded to in your talk, how would you reform it if that's the one nominally legislated tool we've got at the moment? How would you reform it to turn it into the kind of thing that would drive the change that we're talking about?
Let me have a go first because Anthea knows much more about this than I do, and she'll correct me on a few things. But I think for me the trick here is that I don't believe anything. Someone was reminding me that one of their parents has a group that gets together every month and they meet to discuss warmers. And I suspect those of us who are on the stage tonight are warmers. It's used as a derogatory term, by the way. So when you think about this belief issue, the questions to me are we starting to find a situation in which the policy framework would give some credibility to head in the right direction? Now, I've got absolutely no idea about any of those technologies that David talked about will ever deliver the sort of outcome that we've been talking about in response to Tom's question. Only 5 years ago, the two things that were going to save the electricity sector was carbon capture and storage and geothermal. And neither of them have made any progress in the last 5 years. But solar has. So who knows what's going to happen next? But the issue is to get started. So I think the really positive thing here is whether you like the bloody policy or not, and I don't happen to particularly like it, it is in place. It can start to work. I mean, the Emissions Reduction Fund, paying people through an auction to buy stuff is a perfectly valid way to achieve change. It's on budget, so it's nasty from a budget perspective, but Joe Hockey's not treasurer anymore. So maybe, the treasurer we have today will actually think this is a good idea to spend all this money on buying emissions reduction from somebody. If you had enough money, you could certainly do an awful lot. And most people, I suspect, if you live in Melbourne, bought your house at an auction. It's not necessarily a bad way to do things, right, to buy and sell stuff. Secondly, setting the baselines in the way the current government has done does leave the opportunity to tighten those baselines in the future. The trick is that scheme is a bit messy. Setting baselines is hard. Putting it all together so it actually heads towards a firm target, the cap, which you'd put under a cap and trade scheme, is also hard. So for me, the question is, yes, I think this is a place to start. Like, you can't start anywhere else, so therefore let's start here. But let's see how this develops. And I think what we need to see is the community, the people who vote for the politicians, but equally business, saying, right, we need now to see this credibility around these things you've designed. Theoretically, they could be done, but we now need to see some real tangible moves to make sure that they do, because at the moment, I don't think they do much post-2020, at least as yet.
I won't offer corrections, but I'll offer some additional thoughts. So if we think about the two arms of the current policy, so there's the auctions, buying credits. So how that works is that there's these rules about how you can get credit for reducing emissions. So the methodologies all work some version of this, that my emissions were otherwise going to be here and I've done this thing and now they're going to be here and I get a credit for the difference and I can get credit for that and I can offer to sell that to the government. So that's my beginner's guide to that arrangement. We've had, in terms of the sort of scope that mechanisms like that could play for the long term, I think we've had a worldwide large-scale experiment with that kind of paying for credit arrangements. And I think the conclusion internationally is that it's very difficult to do those things to scale. They're good for some things, they will encourage some nice things, that's good, so the clean development mechanism, so that's our big large-scale international experiment. That's really the system where poor countries can create credits, rich countries will buy them to help them meet their own targets. There's a whole international community running around in a flap going, how can we build this up to scale? It's never going to get us completely where we want to go. And if you think about it, for a long-term proposition, just looking at that arm alone, a position where the government buys its way to decarbonisation as a long-term proposition, that's not going to work. So then we look at the other arm of where we are today, and we have a look at the safeguard mechanism. So as Tony's alluded, it's basically there are some limits on what our very largest emitters are allowed to create, and so if they go over that limit, they will need to offset that in some way or pay a penalty. Now, the way things have been set up to date, those limits aren't very binding, I think it's fair to say. And for the electricity sector as a whole, there's a communal limit, and then only if the communal limit is broken do you have any limits on any individual ones. Again, hard to see as it is now how that's going to be a big constraint on emissions. If you start to think about how it might evolve to something that does constrain emissions, lots of versions of how it could, just as technical options, how it could transform to something that actually binds, start looking suspiciously like a cap and trade emissions trading scheme, which is, of course, the thing that we had that we just got rid of. Or you can have lots of variations on a theme, but something that binds, something that, if it's going to be binding, you think, I'd like to have some flexibility in that. Some kind of transition path does start looking suspiciously like some of the things that, at least some kind of relation, possibly a little bit distant in the early stages, some sort of relation to what we may have had in the past.
So we've got some time. We've got about 20, 25 minutes for questions from the audience. There's microphones either side. I just ask everyone to try form it in a question rather than a statement, and try keep it brief, and hopefully the panellists will also keep it reasonably brief in terms of answers so we can get through as many questions as possible. We'll start over here at the right to the gentleman here.
In the calculation of all the greenhouse gases or carbon emissions, is any account taken of carbon emissions from natural phenomena? And in an increasingly warm world, is it likely to be exacerbated by fires and other things which we are witnessing? And to what extent will this turn into a positive feedback mechanism, which as a control engineer, I know it to be a dangerous thing, and what will be its effect?
So that's a really good question, which I could spend the next week trying to answer. But I'll try to keep the answer short. So when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions in the budgets that I talked about, they're really greenhouse gas emissions from human-related activities only. Natural emissions have been in balance over the last 1,000 years or so, but are significantly larger than the human-related emissions. Adding the human-related emissions has led to a significant increase in the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, as I mentioned before, from 280 parts per million being the highest level over the last 1,000,000 years, except in the last 100 years, where we've seen the concentrations grow from 280 parts per million to 400 parts per million, due to this cumulative growth in human emissions adding to concentrations in the atmosphere. The second part of your question was related to really this possible change in the natural emissions due to human activity. And there are a number of ways that a warmer climate system can lead to both negative and positive feedbacks. So let me talk about the negative feedbacks first of all. Warmer climate and higher carbon dioxide can lead to more vegetation growth in previously colder climates. So trees and plants will grow better in a higher CO2 environment in areas that were previously cold. The growing season gets longer, and there's plenty of evidence for this in the high latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere, where trees are growing more, forests are spreading poleward, taking up more carbon dioxide. That's a negative feedback. That's potentially a benefit from climate change if you live in those areas. However, in many hotter and particularly drier areas, warmer temperatures lead to loss of carbon from soils and also greater frequency of fires, burning forests, and also can lead to release of carbon dioxide and methane from previously frozen ground, melting of permafrost or melting of what are called methane clathrates in the ocean. Some of those positive feedbacks are taken into account in those temperature estimates, but not all of them are. So the situation could be significantly worse than scientists have talked about if the known unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld would say, if the known unknowns were taken into account, we could be a lot worse off.
Question up the back on my left.
Hi, I'm in the HVAC and refrigeration industry. We represent roughly, conservatively, 11.7% of Australia's emissions, probably more likely up to 18%. So we're kind of a dirty industry. But we can fix it if we took the same approach that Denmark took. And Sven Orsen, I think in his announcement in 1996, converted Denmark to natural refrigerants. They are all energy efficient than the current synthetic refrigerants. They're all environmentally benign. But we are a tiny, tiny speck in a massive industry with a lot of corporate money and corporate weight against us. How do we get the government to sit up and listen to what are realistic and sensible solutions within our industry?
I think, well, there are some government departments whose job that might be, but I'm not sure. The answer to that partly is if you've seen some of the history of some of these industries that have started to have some impact. I mean, Anthony's already referred to emission standards and so forth, and so when you do that, the only way this is going to work, I suspect, is that when you look at the numbers, this is what makes up our emissions. So much comes from electricity generation, as David said. So much comes from combustion of other fuels. So much, et cetera, et cetera. Some comes from agriculture. All of them have to be to the point where they're approaching net zero in the timescale we're talking about. The only way this is going to work is if we have policies that are a combination of putting that price on carbon, which actually will cause a lot of change, much more than we've thought about, at much lower cost than we've anticipated, as Anthea said. And secondly, in some cases, it will be by regulation. That is, insisting that we have better regulation on the way the standards of the air conditioners we import, the motor vehicles we import, and so forth. Because I think that's going to be the other place. And I think there are going to be situations where industry associations such as your own can start to put those numbers in front of government, because my suspicion is that as they try and make the numbers that up, this will become much more important.
Just very quickly, because other people do want to ask questions.
We actually did have, in the synthetic greenhouse gas levy, we did have and it did make the industry slightly turn, but not one penny of that money collected went to the government, because it was all, the chemical companies imported all of that product 6 months prior, and when it was repealed, not one penny went to the industry or the government.
All right, we might leave that there, and we'll take that as a statement. Can go with the gentleman with the glasses, and then we'll go to Rob Gell after that.
Anthea, you said that we are quite a long way behind in managing emissions from cars in reference to other countries in the world. Could you give us an example of a country which is leading edge in managing car emissions, and what sort of technology they use that we don't?
So in terms of when you're normally talking about who's at the leading edge on vehicle emissions, you're normally talking about Europe, that has the most stringent emissions. That said, even the US, you know, the famous gas-guzzling US, they're significantly better than us now, and with the targets, with the policies that they've already announced for where their standards are going to be going down to, the gap between us and them will increase significantly as well. Most countries have them, so China has them. China has more stringent standards than us, so there's lots and lots and lots of countries in the world, most countries have these kind of standards. We have many, many examples to look to. We know there's a way you do these things. We've got plenty of examples before us about how to do it. So in terms of meeting the standards, there's a well-trodden path ahead of us. Now, in terms of the technology, so there's a couple of things going on here. Why is Australia's vehicle fleet so much more emissions intensive than other countries, you know, comparable countries to us? It's probably a mixture of two things. One, Australians, you know, express through their purchasing habits a preference for some larger and some cases more emissions intensive vehicles. So there's some things that Australians choose to buy. There's a preference for them that are more emissions intensive. The other thing that's going on, we don't know the difference, you know, how exactly the dividing line here, but it does seem that to be the case that Australia, because we don't have standards, if you've got vehicles that you want to sell, if you've got engines that you want to sell that are not that efficient, do you shut down that factory line producing those vehicles? Do you shut down the factory line producing those engines that you can't sell anywhere else anymore? Or do you sell them to a place like Australia that will still take them? There seems to be a bit of that going on as well. So in terms of the technologies, there's lots of technologies, and it's very important to note that the way these standards get implemented, everyone doesn't have to go running around in some, you know, Fiat Bambino tomorrow. There's a huge amount of flexibility in the way that you can create these standards so that it works on an average. You want the average to go down over time. So there's lots of different technologies. There's lightweighting, low rolling resistance tyres, better engines, diesel. There's a whole host of things, all known, kind of perfectly known technologies, nothing strange and weird, that you can put into cars to make them more energy efficient. And it's really about putting these standards in place that give the purchasers, so if you're Toyota or Mazda or whoever, you're required, on average, to meet certain limits. And so that's how it works in every other country. That's how it could work here.
Unless you're Volkswagen. I think we had one here, and then we'll come to you after that.
I think it's a question for David Karoly. The question that doesn't seem to be revisited is whether +2 degrees is a good target or not. James Hansen, former NASA scientist, and I'm sure you'll know, suggests that scientists in the 80s said, let's set a target of +2 degrees because we thought that for sure governments around the world will do things in the interim to make sure we don't get anywhere near it. James Hansen says that +2 degrees is a recipe for disaster because it gives us a global mean temperature we haven't seen since the Eemian. Was James Hansen wrong?
No. I mean, there has been a lot of discussion amongst many different communities and many countries, particularly small island states, for which 2 degrees of warming, the last time that the planet was that warm, had 25 metres higher sea level. And that puts many small island states at about 10 metres below sea level and underwater. So 25 metres of sea level is very, very dangerous for 1 billion people. More than 10% of the world's population, their current habitation is underwater with 2 degrees of warming over an extended period. So it's not safe. We also know, if we come down to Australia, that we are already getting significant increases in bushfires, significant increases in hot extremes, significant changes in rainfall patterns, significant natural extinctions with just 1 degree of global warming. And so you double that and the responses are non-linear. The changes will be much more dramatic. So 2 degrees isn't safe, it's very substantial. And that's why many countries in the world are arguing that 1.5 degrees of global warming still isn't safe, but it's better than 2. And one of the things that the Carbon Tracker project is trying to do is to look at what additional greenhouse gas emission reductions might be achievable to stabilise temperatures at 1.5 degrees, or to go from 2 degrees to then continue emission reductions, continue negative emissions, so that carbon dioxide can be sucked out of the atmosphere to return to a climate which is going to cool on an ongoing basis to something like pre-industrial temperatures. But that is a much, much, much harder target than 2 degrees initially.
We had a question down here in the front.
Sure. Just to go back to the Paris negotiations, Andrea, you mentioned the need for a framework that will ratchet up ambition. Does that exist within the COP process, or can you speak to that?
I'm just trying to remember now. There is something that talks about, there's a sort of no backsliding, it's called the no backsliding kind of things that people have agreed on to date. So we hope that that gets a formalised spot in the Paris arrangements. But as I said, there's that difference between the no backsliding, so no going backwards, but that's not quite the same, and there's an important distinction between being encouraged to, okay, I'll put that down for 2030, but I'm going to come back and revise that and go downwards. So there's nothing there yet, there's certainly nothing that requires it, no one's been talking about requiring it, and it'll be a question about how successful we are in being able to actually encourage it, because as I said before, in the past, we didn't.
So maybe if I could just add to that, there is in fact in the draft Paris agreements a 5-yearly review of emissions and climate, and the opportunity, encouragement for countries to review their INDCs and in fact change them. There is no formal requirement to upgrade them, but there is certainly this 5-yearly review and process to upgrade the INDCs.
And part of that is also that not only is there a review, but there's also processes within the UNFCCC process to force countries to explain their positions. So you saw this recently with Australia at the meetings that were held mid-year. They actually came in for some very tough questioning, at least in my opinion, and I guess in some other observers' opinions, about their 2020 target and I guess some of their domestic policies that sit behind that. So while there's no formal requirement that when you go to a review in 5 years that you should up your target, at least in what looks like the agreement's going to be in Paris. The idea is that you'll be basically peer pressured into doing it at some point into the future. Whether that works or not, I don't know. Do we have any more questions? We've got quite a lot of questions. All right, we'll start with this gentleman here and then we'll come forward. Yeah.
Thank you. A question for the group overall. A lot of what we've been hearing about it seems to be about negative consequences if we don't meet targets. Is there any thought to creating within Australia and even better globally some positive consequences to meeting targets, actually really looking to celebrate success? Because I don't see in this space a lot of celebration of success, and there has been some considerable success.
So you're absolutely right. I mean, both Anthea, I think, and Tony talked about some of the fantastic successes with the introduction of, or the encouragement for the introduction of solar panels in Australia. There was an expectation that it would take 10 years to have 1 million households introduce solar panels, and that happened in about 3 years. Not 10 years, and the growth and uptake of both solar hot water and solar PV systems on houses in Australia has been at a faster rate than any other country in the world. So that's a great success. There are also many other opportunities and benefits for introducing, sort of low carbon economy. There are enormous health benefits. First of all, from phasing out both coal mines and fossil fuel generated electricity and fossil fuel driven transport systems because they produce dangerous air pollutants, both particles and other pollutants, as was demonstrated in the Latrobe Valley fires a couple of years ago. Digging up coal and burning it is dangerous for people's health, not because of the carbon dioxide, just because of the direct sulfur emissions. So we can get a cleaner, healthier environment by not burning fossil fuels. There are also co-benefits from having local distributed electricity sources. It produces more jobs in regional areas through having distributed electricity sources than it does from having concentrated electricity sources, and regional improvements in employment are something that most people would be favourable for, except some of the large electricity and mining companies. But that's probably understandable. So there are many, many benefits, and I can go on and talk about more. There are benefits from having green roofs and more trees in cities because it actually makes the cities cooler, takes up carbon, and actually makes the cities nicer to live in. All of those are co-benefits from approaches to reducing greenhouse gases through carbon capture by trees, and makes the cities more habitable. There are many good things that can come from a low carbon economy.
Anyone want to add to that?
I think the point you raise is illustrated into this, the mess we got in to some extent, because when people gave up on communicating why a central policy which was going to put a price on emissions which seemed to be too negative, it was portrayed as a carbon tax, that was a very successful negative campaign, right? The positive side of it, people were given incentives by state and federal governments to put solar PV on the roof, and they did, in literally 1.5 million of us. So you can see how that story can play out. It is, one of the tricks here, of course, is that there is very little, when you get electricity from solar, it's still electricity. It doesn't actually provide you much extra direct utility. You've got to look at the other things David's been talking about when you start to eliminate some of the other negatives from the way we've been producing our centralised system to date. So I think it can be, but I think I'm a bit more optimistic now that we may see more celebration of opportunity. There's never a better time to be alive in Australia. All that sort of language is a more positive environment maybe as well.
Now we had a question a bit further down that I said I would take. Nope. All right. Missed your shot. We'll go to the lady up in the back here. Take someone from the back.
So a few weeks ago, China committed to 60 to 65% of emissions reductions of 2005 levels by 2030, and the US and China, I guess, committed to a shared vision for the Paris conference. Do you think that will, I guess, produce a more positive and ambitious result?
I think China and the US obviously is the two big elephants in the room. You know, it can't be a success without those two countries, and the fact that they have been willing to speak early about what they're prepared to do and to be actively seen to be cooperating on this front can only be a good thing. It's interesting in Australia how some of that plays out. So some of those celebrate successes and think about some of the co-benefits that you might get from reducing emissions. There's some weird discussions that happen here in Australia. So if China, which it does, wants to reduce its use of fossil fuels, coal in particular, because of health concerns, very real health concerns about the quality of its air, somehow some of that translates to Australia as, you know, they're actively doing things. They've got a gigantic renewables program, a gigantic nuclear program. These things are huge. They're spending a lot of money. They're doing a lot of things, doing all of these sorts of things. But in Australia, that plays as, oh, but they just wanted to do it anyway, so it doesn't count. I find that just bizarre. Similarly, in the US, well, but they found all that shale gas. So there have been a lot of studies that actually the shale gas hasn't been that bigger driver of emissions reductions anyway. It's a bit of a myth. And to get to their targets, they're going to have to rely on a lot more than just subbing out a little bit of coal for gas. There's going to be a whole bunch of things that they're going to need to be doing, that they are putting in place, that they have in place now. Somehow that gets translated here in Australian conversations as a kind of cheating as well. I'm not quite sure why. So it is very important. And are China and the US doing enough to be putting us on a 2-degree path? No. No one is. Everybody needs to do more. But it's certainly a heck of a lot better than not having those two giant players cooperating.
All right, we're a bit over time, but we'll take one more. The lady in the blue here. Sorry, that's very undemocratic, but...
Thank you. I want to lift the discussion above the local here, Australia, but why are we giving fossil fuel subsidies? You know, I think is that going to be discussed at Paris? And the second thing is, apart from carbon dioxide, what about black carbon? I'm wondering, we've had all these Indonesian peat fires recently, you know, absolutely closing schools all over Malaysia and so on. This is another climate forcer. Could you talk a bit about black carbon? That's what I'm really interested in. But the old chestnut of fossil fuel subsidies, could you talk about that? Why we don't do it?
Well, I mean, the biggest fossil fuel subsidy is the fact we don't include in the cost of burning fossil fuels the environmental damage that it causes. That's the biggest fossil fuel subsidy we've ever heard of. And when you look at the IMF have done the numbers on this, and it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars per year. It's a non-trivial number, obviously. In fact, I think it might be in the single-digit trillions. So there is a significant subsidy there. In Australia, there have been various forms of subsidy supports for a whole range of things, including various forms of mining and exploration for fossil fuels. There remains a significant diesel excise rebate exclusion in certain sectors. Other than that, we don't have some of the direct fossil fuel subsidies that many other countries have, but the biggest one, I think, is the first one, and that's why it becomes so important to put that price on carbon, because otherwise we are continuing to kid ourselves in how cheap our electricity is, for example. But the other issue of black carbon, do you want to...
Yeah, so black carbon is essentially associated with the particulates that's produced from low temperature burning of fossil fuels. It's essentially just soot, but gets into the atmosphere, causes all sorts of health problems, but it also causes warming of the atmosphere because black material absorbs sunlight, warms the lower atmosphere. It has a relatively short lifetime. It gets washed out when it rains, so when the fires stop or when it's raining, this black carbon basically is washed out of the atmosphere, as happens with most air pollutants. So you're absolutely right, black carbon is a major warming issue, but it's a relatively short-term warming issue, whereas carbon dioxide doesn't get washed out. Carbon dioxide has a long-term effect in terms of increasing concentrations, and then it takes thousands of years for natural processes to remove the increase in concentration associated by emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. There's a big timescale difference, and that's why the focus is often on carbon dioxide, because of the long time it takes for natural processes to remove that carbon dioxide introduced by human activity. The emphasis in Paris is primarily on long-lived greenhouse gases rather than on the air pollutants associated with things like soot and black carbon.
All right, well, we've just run a little bit over time, so we might call it there. I'd like to thank our panellists, David Karoly, Anthea Harris, Tony Wood.